You wouldn't know what to do in this situation, the same way that I didn't. Surrounded by strangers, trapped in some bizarre village in the woods, forced to pick sides and play a sick game. I had no idea who was my real friend and who was my enemy. After we realized that we were totally trapped, we were forced to comply and hear Dr. Doyle out. He seemed sincere when he told us that he was in the same boat that we were in. Everybody here was tricked and trapped in the same way that we were. And we thought that that was the worst part until the first game started. And the game was so specifically sick, and it almost caused us to take 2 innocent lives, only to find out that these games seemingly never end and they only get more sinister. I want to know, what is the brass and what are they talking about with this vote? And why is she talking about blindsides? Nobody's giving us a clear answer on what this is. So I very frustratedly say to her, why are you talking to me like I know what you're talking about? We just got here. What's the brass? Why do you keep talking about voting? And Heidi looks super surprised. She's taken aback. And she starts off by saying, Dr. Doyle didn't tell you? One must go every week, no later than noon, but voted so by friends who lie and swoon. We're all forced to vote every week, and the person that has the most votes is given to the gap. None of us are safe. I can't even begin to comprehend why that wasn't said to us sooner. And it actually made me super upset in that moment. I was so sick of this slow drip of information. And I couldn't tell if they were doing it so slowly because they thought it would be better for Bobby and I's mental health. But the reality was that they weren't doing us any favors, because to be continuously blindsided by things that you weren't expecting was what was really putting us through a loop. And I took a moment to gather myself because I didn't feel like Heidi deserved the brunt of my frustration. So I took a deep breath and I said this to her. Heidi, do you mind taking us somewhere where you can tell us literally everything, so we could stop walking around like we're a couple of morons? And I could see in Heidi's face that she understood where we were coming from. And she very quickly dropped all of the relationship gossip and she quickly said, I'm so sorry, I've been exactly where you are. Here, let me take you to the map room. It'll make sense. And I promise I'll answer every single question that you have. That was music to our ears. And we followed her to a small cabin a couple structures over from the tavern. It was about 1/4 the size of the tavern and probably could have been used as a storage shed. We walked in, closed the door behind us, and before we were able to get any questions out, we took in our surroundings. There were drawings and sketches all over the walls, and there was one very large table in the middle of the room that was covered with 5 maps. They weren't just sheets of paper like your typical map, they were more like mini replicas. And one of these replicas was the village and the surrounding forest. And this replica was completely surrounded by the massive rock walls that were closing us into this place. And then there were 4 additional maps, and these maps seemed to be what was behind the gap in each season, so the 4 different seasons. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like these were amazing replicas. It's not like we walked into a professional Dungeons and Dragons setup. And if I'm being completely honest with you, looking around at all of this information that they gathered, I was not very hopeful. Nothing was organized, nothing was detailed. And it was clear that countless people attempted to add their knowledge to this collection, but nobody was on the same page. And there definitely wasn't anybody there consistently to organize all of this information and make it look good, or to even make it legible. The only reason I was able to tell which one of the maps was the one that we went through is because the second layer had a horrible illustration of a river. And based on that, I knew that that was the season that we went through. And to give you an idea of just how unhelpful this map room was, the 3rd layer of the map that we had went through was literally just scribbled out in black. There was no additional information other than that. So I guess by looking at this horrible illustration, you could come to the conclusion that it's dark in that 3rd layer. But it doesn't clearly say that, and it doesn't indicate any of the type of things that you're going to bump into in there. And I don't know if I was expecting there to be this well of knowledge and all of these answers, but seeing this room just bummed me out. Because to me, it was a sign that the people here weren't really trying. What's that one saying? When you want to get your life together, the first thing you should do is clean your room. If you have no idea where to start, the best thing that you could do is organize your space. And I couldn't believe that all of the people here hadn't been putting the majority of their attention towards this room and trying to organize this information the best that they could. It felt so lazy to me and it made me so frustrated. And the cherry on top of all of this was that there was 4 stacks of paper that seemed to have journal entries on them in various different handwritings. And apparently those 4 stacks of paper, not very large stacks might I add, were the reports of all of the people that had made it back through the gap. And it was basically a summary of what happened to them and anything that they could remember during their experience. It was the most ridiculous system that I had ever seen. It was dirty, it was unorganized, nothing was clear. It's like these people weren't even trying to get out of this place. And I don't know if I was devastated or infuriated by this, but I turned towards Heidi and I said, "Is this it? Is this all you guys have?" And Heidi looks at me as if she was feeling the same level of frustration that I was feeling. And she starts to go on a tangent. "Yeah, this is all we have. But it's not like we haven't been trying. It's really hard to get information on what's out there when most people don't come back. And it's even harder to stay organized when everybody's backstabbing each other and everybody's working against each other. We've been trying to send out the most qualified and ready person each time. We've tried to get everybody to come together and build a system to figure this place out. But every time we have a little bit of momentum, something happens. It's always something. And the vote always creeps up every week no matter what. So whatever alliances and partnerships that you think you're building, no matter what plan you have in motion, no matter what system you're trying to put into place to gather information, the vote rolls around every week and throws a stick in your spokes. So here, let me catch you up. I'm going to do my best here to explain everything. The Brass is Dr. Doyle's alliance. It's a group of us that are trying our best to gather information and work together as a team. There's supposed to be 10 people in the Brass, but we haven't gotten more than 6 votes our way in the past 3 months. So 4 people in our alliance are secretly voting against us every week. And we have no idea who they are because the voting is completely anonymous and everybody denies it. And also, let me clear this up. We didn't call ourselves the Brass. We didn't name ourselves that. When Dr. Doyle first came here, he was the only one that could read the rules of the main vote. So before everybody knew the rules and they were ignoring the vote, the gap would open every week. Something would come through and massacre the people that lived here. There was absolutely no order here until Dr. Doyle came and was able to translate the rules. And when he first got here, it was one of the first things that he said, and nobody believed him. When he read the rules and he suggested that everybody were to vote, they all voted for him to test it out. It was his first day here. He didn't even really know where he was, and he had to go out into the gap alone. But nothing came and massacred the people that night. The gap didn't open. So when he eventually made it through and made it back to the village, they knew that he was right about the whole thing, and he garnered a lot of respect around here. People finally had some hope. They weren't getting massacred on a weekly basis, and they started listening to him. He suggested to everybody that we do our best to study as much of the information that we have, and that we should start sending the most qualified person every week that was the most likely to get through and come back so we could continue gathering information. He figured that if we were all working together and all voting together, we might be able to create a system where we could learn everything about this place, and we could all make it out together. And it was working for a few months. There was a real order here. People were building real friendships and real relationships. We were making collective decisions as a group. And even when the really messed up games would pop up, people would volunteer and they would step up to take punishments. And after those games, everybody would support each other and we would take turns spreading the suffering so nobody would get the brunt of it. So even with all of this sick, twisted stuff going on, we had a sense of community and we had a purpose. We had a goal. Nobody called us the Brass. Everybody was the Brass. We were all working together to get out of here. But then for some reason, one random day, there was this weird vibe around the village and I couldn't put my finger on it. And I started hearing whispers and rumors and concerns. And over the course of the next few days leading up to the vote, something felt off. And it was the first time in months where the person that was supposed to be going into the gap, the most qualified person, the most likely to get back, didn't get voted. It was the first blindside that we experienced, and the people that weren't in on it, the people that were on the wrong side of the vote, had no idea what happened. It took weeks for us to figure out who was stirring the pot. But then finally, after weeks and weeks of following the whispers and the rumors, we realized that Blake was the source of it all. And it was so bizarre because she was the sweetest, most scared girl when I first met her. She was so lovely and so considerate. But then something flipped in her. She changed, and she became this sabotaging monster that was completely power hungry. And she started announcing to the group, she started calling us the brass, and she made it seem as if there was some type of hierarchy inside of our group. She put this authoritarian label on the brass and started villainizing us every chance that she got. She progressively caused so much chaos around the village, so much so that she was able to sway people's allegiances away from us and into her. She pretty much made it seem like we were horrible people, willing to sacrifice people. And eventually it was going to be everybody's turn. But if they gave their allegiance to her, she would guarantee them that they would never have to go through the gap. It would never be their turn. She played on people's fears, and she basically said, if you're loyal to me, I promise you're never gonna have to risk your life. You're going to be able to live a full life here. And when you're in a place like this, that message speaks to some people. So all of that information that Heidi had just told us was very valuable, and it made things make a lot more sense, especially regarding the complex dynamics around this village. But what didn't make sense to us was the fact that people thought that they were going to be able to live a full life here. And Bobby must have been thinking the same thing, because he asked Heidi, how do people expect to live here long term without working together? If everybody's at each other's throats, where's the food coming from? And I could tell by the way Heidi took a deep breath that she knew that the answer to that question was going to take another long answer. But that's what we were here for. We were here for the entire pie, not another slice. So Heidi goes, so whatever or whoever created this place clearly wants us to stay here. It doesn't make it hard on us to survive. Those same parchment papers that we write our votes on once a week, we also write a grocery list on one once a week. And all we have to do is leave that parchment paper in the pantry in the tavern, and the next morning, everything that was on that parchment is in the pantry. But it's only food and raw ingredients. We've tried to ask for tools and weapons and technology. Everything you could imagine, we've tried to ask for. But it will only give us food. And before you ask, yes, we've tried to stay in the pantry to see who fills it overnight, but nobody ever comes. Dr. Doyle even stayed in there overnight to see if anything would happen, but nothing did. It only works if you leave only the list in there overnight. We've sat on the outside of the door listening closely to see if we hear anything, if we hear any noises that are suspicious, anything going on inside of the pantry, but nothing. No matter what we tried, it didn't change the fact that the food seemed to appear out of nowhere. And eventually you start to focus on what really matters, and that's finding an exit. And I'm not telling you that you guys can't go and test it or see how it works. I know it's bizarre. Everybody here understands if you're curious and you want to go do the same tests that we did. But don't expect everybody to be as invested as you are. People go to the tavern for a hot meal and a little bit of hope. It's the only place here that feels remotely normal. A magic pantry was a lot to digest in that moment, but Heidi was right. There were more important things to talk about because the next vote was coming up, and we wanted to know what everybody was thinking. She mentioned that the brass suggests to send the person that's the most prepared, but apparently Blake and her gang of ragtag villains just choose people out of personal vendettas. So the obvious question to ask Heidi was, who's going to be voted out next? Do you know? So that's exactly what I asked. Who do you think they're targeting for this next vote? And Bobby piled on top of my question by asking, is it going to be the same thing that we had just went through? Because if it's going to be the same, we should probably gather everybody and tell them exactly what we had just went through to prepare them. Heidi answered Bobby's question first because it was much simpler. And she said, unfortunately, it's not going to be the same one that we just went through. We don't get that one back for another year. Summer just ended, so it just changed. So it's important that we all write our experience today while it's still fresh, so we're more prepared for next year. And for a split second it hit me that Heidi was planning on potentially being here for another year. But that horrifying thought was cut off with an answer to my initial question. And Heidi goes, I hear that Blake is targeting Nathan. I've heard whispers that Blake and Nathan had a pretty ugly altercation the other day. And apparently Nathan was making a lot of sense, and a lot of Blake's supporters seemed to be siding with him. And Blake did not like the narrative that he was spinning. So I'm pretty sure she's gonna pull some strings, make some threats, and gonna have him voted out. Because even though he called her out in a lot of ways, I've been hearing that it wasn't enough to sway the people that are loyal to her. Because they aren't loyal to a person they love. Those people could be swayed. They're scared of Blake. And in the recent months, if you crossed her, you were next up. And most of the people here are not willing to risk that. They were happy that Nathan put a target on his back, so there wasn't a target on theirs. And the brass is actually happy about this because they feel like Nathan has a pretty high chance of getting through. So the brass is actually going to be voting with Blake this time. Voting with the crazy girl seemed a little bit counterproductive to me, but I'd be lying to you if I said it wasn't relieving knowing that your name wasn't on the table. It's a very good feeling knowing that you're safe. And part of me in that moment was able to understand why so many people here are loyal to Blake. Because very selfishly, I was relieved when she told me that the name was Nathan and everybody was on board. And I couldn't think of any other follow-up questions for Heidi in that moment. So she let us know what she felt like was the best next steps for our group. She said, "I think we should spend most of our time here in the map room until the vote. I've learned here that the best bet is to lay low. You want to avoid conversations about strategy as much as you possibly can. And spending your time in here studying is your best chance of surviving. It's the only reason we got through. Plus, we just went through a lot. We experienced a lot of details that weren't in here, so I think it's important that we do our best to give our best detailed summary to add to this collection of knowledge." Heidi was totally right. The best thing that we could do is make sure that we write everything down while it's still fresh. So I look towards Bobby just to make sure with my boy that we're on the same page, and he gives me an agreeing nod. And I could tell that he does not want to be talking to any of the other people here. And I couldn't agree more. The only people that I wanted to speak to here was Heidi, Dr. Doyle, and Bobby. No new friends. They seemed to be the only people here with their heads on straight. Everybody else was a little wacky. And if they weren't wacky, they were borderline evil and loyal to Blake. And if they weren't loyal to Blake, they were just weird and asking you as many questions as they possibly could to find out who you were voting for. So they could either vote with you so they're on the right side of the vote, or villainize you and report back to Blake to put a target on your back instead. So we decided to hunker down in the map room for days. We did the most detailed entries that we possibly could for any of the people that came after us, and we spent countless hours reading old journal entries trying to prepare ourselves for this upcoming gap just in case. We did our best to try to organize the maps and the drawings and interpret some of the old journal entries. And the only breaks that we would take from studying and organizing was to go eat lunch at the tavern, or to do a lap around the entire place to get some fresh air away from everybody. And over the course of a few days, we had briefly met some of the other brass members as they came in to briefly study in the map room. And a lot of them would try to read an entry a day just to stay sharp, but we could tell that most of them had probably read everything that we were currently reading. None of them would ever stay long or be too chatty, and nobody outside of the brass would ever come in the map room to study. Because why would they? They know that they're not going to be voted out, and they think that if they stay loyal to Blake, they're never going to have to worry about going through the gap. So why would they waste their time studying it? So days are passing and you could feel the tension slowly rising in this place. We were actively avoiding interaction, but as we were walking through the village and eating at the tavern, we could visibly observe that people were getting more and more anxious as the vote was approaching. People were whispering, slight arguments were breaking out. Everybody seemed on edge, and the underlying energy was that people were trying to point fingers at each other. It's not that people were mad and frustrated, they were just scared and anxious. But what was even weirder than the people that would get frustrated and start fights were the people that would become overly nice. They were trying so hard to come off as likable and useful that it came off as scary. Like their strategy to stick around was to do bizarre acts of kindness. But these acts of kindness came off as so insincere because everybody knew what they were doing. It seemed as if everybody had an ulterior motive because everybody here was in survival mode. And we would only observe this from a distance while we were at the tavern. We actively avoided these types of interactions, but there was one interaction that we absolutely could not ignore because it happened right next to us. It was the afternoon the day before the next vote, and an altercation broke out between a man and two women. We obviously did our best to keep to ourselves and ignore the fact that we were intently listening on what they were saying to each other. But this wasn't a voting altercation. This was clearly a lover's quarrel. All three of them, the man and the two women, were the same genre of person. And I only say that because they had a very similar look and tattoo style. They all looked like they probably owned Harley Davidson motorcycles and probably drove them around in big groups. And I'm not saying they looked like they were in a biker gang. I'm saying that they looked like they were into that kind of thing based on their general appearance. And the altercation that they were having was very brief. The man and one of the women were clearly closer in age. The third woman in this quarrel was clearly quite a bit younger. And just based off of context clues, I could tell that the older woman was either his wife or his long-term partner. And the younger woman was a suspected mistress. And the long-term partner clearly gave the man some type of ultimatum, but the man couldn't make a decision, so she freaked out and stormed out. Instead of giving her a clear answer, he suggested that they could all be together. And with all of the crazy things going on, that might have been the wildest thing that I had heard here. Suggesting to your wife to add a third person into your partnership while trying to make it seem like you're making a strategic move. Pitching the idea to your wife that 3 of you would be stronger together. Like, yeah, right, dude, I know what you're up to, we all do. The weirdest part was that the younger one seemed to be into it, but the older one was devastated and stormed out of the tavern. And a couple minutes went by until that same horrible sound came ringing through our bodies right as we were finishing up our lunches. Someone found another game and the entire tavern cleared out in a couple of moments. And I don't know why I thought the games didn't happen that often. I thought we did one this week, so we had some time. I thought that there was no way that they could happen this frequently. But the realization that these games happen multiple times a week, and the week always ending with the main vote, made it make a lot more sense why everybody here is so stressed out. This place was constant chaos. It felt like you could never let your guard down. It didn't matter. Every single day something horrible could happen. And we had no choice but to follow everybody out of this tavern and go find the new game. And I felt my anxiety rising as we were closing in on where the group was congregating. Since the last game was specifically about us, it felt like this one could be too. And everything in me, selfishly, did not want to be a part of this game. I feel like since we were the victims of the last one, somebody else should step up and be the victims of this one. And it's crazy how quickly your mind starts making justifications for your own safety. Because when we were being told about how villagers acted around these games and around the votes, it seemed selfish and it honestly seemed crazy. But as we were walking up to this new game, I found myself feeling those feelings and feeling those sensations. I was convincing myself in my own mind that since I was the last one to do it, somebody else should have to do this one. I felt entitled to some level of immunity, even though I shouldn't have. And I started to understand these people a little bit better in that moment. And as the game started, I also started to understand something very sinister about this place. These little mini games before the main vote were used to destroy trust and to keep the chaos flowing. And just like last time, everybody was congregated around the game that presented itself. And we all had to wait for Dr. Doyle to show up. And when he did, the seas parted. He walked up, he started to read the sign, and he started to comprehend the rules. And then he gave his interpretation of the rules to the crowd. He very reluctantly announced to the group that we needed one leader. And he said it as if he knew who was going to volunteer and he knew who was going to win. And again, the first hand that shoots up in the crowd is Blake with that horrible smile on her face. And again, the second hand that shoots up is Heidi because Heidi knows that Blake has it out for her. And Dr. Doyle announces to the group that he was not going to volunteer to be the leader, but if he did and somebody was planning on voting for him, please turn your vote to Heidi instead of him because he was opting out of volunteering. It all was happening so quickly and it seemed so routine to everybody that was here. Since the last one was focused on us and we didn't know what to expect, it felt like a fever dream and we were so filled with shock and anxiety ridden that we didn't notice how comfortable everybody else was in these moments. There was a clear routine here and it didn't take long for everybody to choose who the leader was. It was an absolute blowout. Blake won. We couldn't believe it because we had only seen this horrible, devious side of Blake. Why are these people putting their trust into her? But again, they thought that putting their trust into Blake meant that they were safe as an individual. So after Blake was in charge, Dr. Doyle had to continue with the rest of the rules, but he had to go step by step. First, he instructed Blake to choose 3 people to participate. And then one of those 3 people were going to be the decision maker. And I was very surprised who she chose. She chose 3 people that voted for her to be the leader. And I didn't realize why she was doing that. I thought for sure she was going to choose Heidi or somebody that opposed her in the brass. But it all made sense when she announced the first name. The man that she chose was Nathan. And Heidi whispered to me that Nathan only voted for her to be the leader because he didn't want to be on the wrong side of the vote. He had already given her pushback that week, and he started to hear whispers that his name was being thrown around. And he apologized to her and then voted for her to be the leader of this game to gain her trust back. But apparently Blake is as petty as it gets, and she holds vendettas because Nathan was the name that came out of her mouth. And then she proceeded to choose 2 women who had also voted for her, one being a slightly older woman and one being a slightly younger one. And it also turned out that Nathan happened to be the man in the lover's quarrel that we overheard at the tavern. Blake had chosen this love triangle to be the participants of the game. But the weird part was that Blake wasn't in the tavern when the altercation happened. So how would she know that this love triangle was going on? But it made me realize just how much power Blake had, because clearly people in this village were reporting back to her anything that they noticed. She clearly had spies everywhere, and she knew what was going on because she had the biggest smile on her face when she chose those three, as if she knew all of the context. And once she had the 3 people chosen, Dr. Doyle let the entire group know the rest of the rules of the game. Nathan was going to have to choose to remove 1 tattoo from one of their bodies. And when I heard that part, it made me think maybe Blake didn't know about the love triangle part, and she only knew the rules that Dr. Doyle had whispered to her beforehand. Because like I said, all 3 of these people looked like biker people, and they were covered in traditional tattoos. All of them had the daggers, the hearts, the roses, the little sparrows with ribbons all over their legs and arms and neck. So I thought for a second, maybe she chose these 3 because they all had very visible tattoos. So maybe they were just the most eligible for this game. But the look on Blake's face told me otherwise. She looked like she was enjoying watching this man suffer. It looked like she enjoyed putting him in a situation where he had to choose which woman that he loved that he was going to carve into. He was handed a scalpel by Dr. Doyle and was told that he had 1 minute to choose, and then he would have to begin carving it out of the woman. And he got to choose whatever tattoo that he wanted to. And both of the women are frantically crying, begging for him to not choose them. And of course these 2 women are freaking out. They're facing mutilation without any anesthesia or painkillers. The tension was building and the women are panicking, and Nathan was crying about the decision that he had come to. Dr. Doyle pleaded with him to make a decision, and he finally did. He pointed towards the mistress, the younger girl, and his long-term partner, the older woman, initially looked so relieved. Just because she was like, he loves me, he saved me, he doesn't want to carve into me. But she started to freak out again when he chose what tattoo he was going to remove from the younger woman. He chose a heart tattoo that was on her arm, and the heart had a ribbon going across it with the name David on it. And this horrible, cruel game broke out into a random, sporadic mutilation while he was justifying his decision making on what tattoo he chose to remove. It's like this place was capitalizing on their drama to maximize the suffering that was happening, emotional and physical. The older woman was freaking out because he chose to remove a tattoo that represented an old relationship that this potential mistress was in. He was choosing to remove a tattoo off of her that had another man's name on it. And she had plenty of tattoos to choose from, but he chose that one. So the older woman took that as if he was being possessive over her. And she's yelling at him things like, I knew you hated to look at that tattoo because it's proof another man had her. Well, this younger girl is just screaming in agony as he's slicing into her and peeling this tattoo off of her as she's wide awake. And the older woman screaming at him that he should have chose her and cut out the tattoo that she got for him. She had a very similar tattoo with a bird and a ribbon going across it with the name Nathan on the ribbon. But Nathan was justifying it, telling his long-term partner that he didn't want to hurt her. But this younger girl had told Nathan about how her ex-partner David had been abusive to her. So taking that tattoo off of her was doing her a favor without having to hurt his long-term partner. But as a spectator, I was honestly siding with the older woman. To me, it was pretty clear that he was being possessive over this younger woman, while he was still trying to keep his name tattooed on his long-term partner because he was still trying to swing this 3-way relationship. And this entire crowd is standing there watching this love triangle scream at each other as he's slowly peeling off a medium-sized chunk of this poor girl's skin. And once he finally gets this last piece off, he walks it up to Dr. Doyle and hands it to him. This flappy piece of flesh, and they leave the scalpel and the piece of flesh on the table that was presented to us, and everybody starts to disperse as if this was just an everyday thing, even though we just watched a live mutilation. It was like watching a live amateur surgery mixed with a soap opera. There was so much pain inside of that love triangle, physical and emotional. It made me nauseous, the entire scene in general, but everybody else seemed to be used to it. Even Heidi just turned around and started to walk away back towards the map room. And obviously we followed her because being with somebody that's that calm in that situation, it rubs off on you. And I'm trying to come up with what question I want to ask her about that bizarre experience. But Heidi says something that stops me from asking about it. She said, "That's why I told you guys not to interact with people. It's best to lay low because the more people you get involved with, the larger target you become. Trust me, I was just in a situation like that. Let's get back to the map room and study because the real vote is tomorrow. And I promise you're going to need energy for tomorrow because it gets weird. We were sleeping in the map room too on little homemade cots on the floor. So once we were in there and Heidi finally fell asleep, Bobby and I got to chat a little bit. It was very brief, but Bobby asked me, "Do you think this place is going to change us?" And I replied truthfully. I said, "I think it already has." And I followed up by asking him exactly what I was thinking about. "Do you actually think there's a way out?" And Bobby replied, "I know there is, and we're gonna find it. I don't care how many times we have to go through that gap. I'm not dying here, and I'm not gonna end up like them, just waddling around this place trying to survive." I was very happy to know that he hadn't given up. I could feel the motivation coming through his words, and I had the same fire in my chest. I was not ready to give up. I wanted to find an exit. No matter how long it took, I was not going to surrender to the idea that this place was my forever home. And we dozed off that night with the little bit of optimism that we gave to each other. And we woke up the next day on our first voting day. And it was more bizarre than Heidi could have ever explained to us. It's like this entire place was in a manic frenzy. From the moment that we woke up, everybody was scrambling and talking to each other, whispering and making a case for themselves. People brought us breakfast and drinks and were asking us if we needed anything else from them, only to whisper in our ears at the end, "Who are you voting for?" There was no staying away from people this day. There was no minding your own business. The level of frantic energy around the area was unavoidable, and there was nothing you could do but fend off the village members that were trying to come up and talk to you. It was so oddly polite and so fake. Every single word that was coming out of their mouth had an ulterior motive, and everybody was just trying to get information about what way the vote was going, because the only thing that mattered to them was being on the right side of the vote. And nobody has any idea if their name is up in the air to be voted out, and they're trying to get any inkling that they might be the target so they could immediately point a finger in a different direction. There were clear leaders and clear decision makers around the village, and it seemed as if people were flocking to Blake, flocking to Dr. Doyle, but then also, interestingly, flocking to Heidi, Bobby, and I. And I think it was because we were probably with Heidi, or it might have been because we made it back through the gap, and we had sacrificed our firearms to save people's lives. Maybe that gave us some level of respect and authority here, or at least a perceived authority. Because we personally felt absolutely lost. We would turn to Heidi and Dr. Doyle for anything. But maybe we were mistaking a perceived authority for the village members just not having any idea which way our votes were going. They had no gauge on who we were or who we were loyal to. But there was no telling what was sincere and what was manipulative. It felt as if everybody drank 3 espressos that morning and just couldn't keep their mouths shut. And Heidi told us to simply reply one line to everybody that she used all day. "I'm voting with the brass," which basically meant I'm voting with the majority, but I'm not the person making the decision on who the person is going to be. Answering their question like that forced them to go speak to Dr. Doyle or one of the other core brass members to get more information. It also allowed us to not have to say a name, because if we said the name that we were supposed to be voting for, it meant that we were personally targeting somebody, and they could go report back to somebody else and use that as leverage against us, therefore putting a target on our backs. If you tell somebody you're just voting with the group, you're telling that person, "I'm just like you. I'm just doing what I'm told. No hard feelings to anybody. I am not a decision maker." And the vote was going to start in about 30 minutes, and everybody started congregating in the middle of the village. We hadn't spent so much time walking around the common area of the village near the bleachers and the podium. The only time that we were really hanging out over there was when we were in a very serious altercation and we weren't really taking in our surroundings. So we're just lollygagging around the general area when I noticed something that I hadn't seen before. And initially, I thought it was another random game that popped up and I was about to hear a bell go off. But when I pointed at it to get Heidi's attention, she kind of rolled her eyes to make it seem like that thing is not a big deal. It was like a big cylinder lock puzzle, and it was held up by 4 legs, like it was a small table, but the top of it, there were revolving numbers. It was like a large combination lock that had a handle sticking out on one side, and the handle looked like it was the handle to like a knife or a sword or some type of paddle of some sort. So I walk up to this thing fast, like gesturing towards it, and Heidi is just rolling her eyes about it. And she just goes, "Don't worry about that thing, it's always here. We don't think that there's any punishment for ignoring it. It's been here longer than everybody here, it's been here the whole time." And I immediately respond, "Do you think there's a reward for solving it?" And Heidi, in a very lackluster tone, says, "Maybe, but it's a 12 number combination." And I immediately clap back at her. "Well, what if I already know 3 of them? Now we only need 9 numbers. And Heidi and Bobby's eyes shoot open wide because they could tell that I'm being dead serious. I know 3 of these numbers because I saw them on the bottom of the stepladder while we were in the gap. And I'll never forget those numbers, 383. And I know for sure that they correlate with this combination lock because this lock's combination is broken up into sections of 3 numbers. So I follow up by telling them, while I was holding onto that ladder over the river, I saw that 383 was carved into one of the steps of the ladder. And Bobby immediately says, I saw 513 on the bottom of the cup. And Heidi and I both swing our heads towards Bobby and he repeats himself. Guys, 513 was on the bottom of the cup while we were collecting ink out there. And Heidi mumbles under her breath, 201. So Bobby and I both whip our heads towards Heidi and demand for her to speak up. She enunciates a little bit louder this time. I saw a tattoo on the forearm of one of those things that were whispering to us. She had a tattoo on the front of her forearm that said 201. And all of us are staring at each other wide-eyed, realizing that all of us had major pieces of information that none of us thought were significant until this moment. So we hustle over to the combination puzzle and Heidi starts punching in those numbers, and she puts them in the order in which we found them. 513 from the cup, then 383 from the ladder, then 201 from the darkness. We only needed 3 more numbers and we were going to be able to open this puzzle that had been here longer than anybody else here. This could be our first major step to getting out of this place. And we're absolutely freaking out in our internal group, trying to not make a massive scene. Because the vote starts in like less than 20 minutes and there's a bunch of people around. And some people are looking at us, but they know that Bobby and I are new. And we probably don't know what this thing is. So they're not assuming that we're solving it. They probably are just assuming that we're learning about its existence and we're curious about it. And Dr. Doyle walks up after a few minutes because now the main vote is only a couple minutes away. And he walks up to us because he sees in our energy that something is going on. And that's exactly what he says to us. What's going on with you 3? And Heidi speaks up before Bobby and I even can. And she says, Doyle, we're 3 digits away from solving this thing. And Dr. Doyle's eyes get super wide and he gets closer to us so nobody else could hear him. And he says, follow me, but do it discreetly. Pretend I'm showing you 2 how voting goes. So as calmly as we possibly can, we walk over to the podium with Dr. Doyle. And he pulls out a stack of the parchment paper that everybody has to write a name onto. And he holds it up to us as if he's showing us the paper. But this is what he says. Guys, pretend you're looking at the paper, but look at the inside of the podium. Look at the small shelf under there. There's a carving on it. It's usually hidden under the parchment paper. Can anybody read it from here? And Bobby has the best angle and he whispers to all of us. It says, find his name, -511. I initially think that it's kind of weird that there's a message written in the podium. And the -511 indicates that this message was written by somebody named 511. And even though it's a little bit confusing, it doesn't change the fact that it's another 3-digit combo. So we discreetly walk back over to the combination puzzle and we throw 511 on the back end. We try to pull the handle that's sticking out of the combination puzzle, but it doesn't budge. And at this point, the vote is closing in on us and people are starting to congregate, so we can't really hide what we're doing. So we switch up the combination. We put 511 at the beginning and then all of the numbers in the same order behind it. And the entire village is circled around the area at this point, anticipating the vote that's about to happen. And Bobby grabs onto the handle once all of the numbers are in the new order. And like butter, this thing slides out, combination completed. Literally every single person in the village saw him do it, and everybody has this amazed expression on their face. But that amazement on their faces was also slightly tainted with fear, because nobody knows what's gonna come with this puzzle being solved. At this point, everybody has their vote in mind. They kind of know how the day is gonna go. And even though it was horribly manic all day, people start to get a sense of security going into the vote because they think they know which way it's going. But now this happened and they don't know what this action changes. So now there's fear boiling around the entire community. And none of us know if a bell is gonna ring or the gap's gonna randomly open or if celebratory fireworks are gonna go off. We don't know if an exit is gonna open. We have no idea how finishing this puzzle is going to affect things. The only thing that was clear was that there was a message on the paddle that Bobby was holding that we pulled out of this combination puzzle. And just like every other message in this village, it's written in Gaelic. But he doesn't even need to hand it over to Dr. Doyle to read it, because it only had 3 words on it. Doyle was able to read it immediately while it was still in Bobby's hands, and he announced to the group what it said, because it's not like he could hide it. Everybody witnessed us open it, so he has to share it with the group. And Dr. Doyle announces to the group what it says, but he doesn't seem excited about it. He goes, "Everybody, it says, go through hell." The entire crowd gasps, and I cringe at the thought that we could have went home. We could have gotten out of here, but we made the wrong choice while we were in the gap. Everybody else seemed privy to the fact that there was an option to go through hell inside of the gap. And I'm assuming that Dr. Doyle told everybody about his experience. But Heidi, Bobby, and I were absolutely devastated because we chose the 2 wrong options while we were out there. We were lucky we were all out there at the same time though, because if it was only one of us, we probably would have only found 1 number combination. But because all 3 of us were out there, we were able to find 3/4 of the combination. So on the bright side, we would only have to go back through the gap 1 more time, and we would know which one to choose. We would know to go through hell the next time. The entire crowd is whispering and freaking out internally because nobody knows what this new information is going to change. Like, does it mean that whoever gets voted today now knows what to do and they might go home? Having a clue that specific must be tantalizing for somebody that wants to escape, that hasn't accepted the reality here, and they want to go home. Knowing that you actually have a chance to get out, if you get to the end, that changes things. So who knows if somebody's going to try to volunteer? Who knows if multiple people are going to try? So everybody's whispering and chatting, and Dr. Doyle makes it a point to get everybody to calm down. And he calls everybody over to congregate onto the bleachers to start this week's vote because we were running out of time. The voting process is pretty simple. Everybody goes up one by one and writes a name on a piece of parchment paper. And once everybody is voted, Dr. Doyle counts the votes and tells everybody who received the most. And once he reads the results of the vote, the gap opens and whoever was voted needs to go through the gap immediately. Everybody knew that the game plan was to vote out Nathan, and it didn't seem like anybody was volunteering even though they knew to go through hell. And I was assuming that everybody probably wanted a week to refresh themselves on what's probably behind this season's gap before they volunteered to risk it. But I knew that there was probably going to be volunteers the next week. I mean, there was a part of me that wanted to volunteer for next week. So everybody went up and voted, and Dr. Doyle counted the votes. And before he read out the results, he said one thing. Everybody, let's not have a fiasco like last week. Only one person is supposed to go through the gap at a time. Our new friends here only went through with Heidi last week because they didn't know what they stumbled into. No matter the results, we do not lose more than one person a week. Is that understood? Everybody nodded their heads in agreement. Then Dr. Doyle looked up from the parchment paper at the group of villagers and announced who was voted out. And he looked right at me when he said it. The majority of the votes went to Bobby. And I look at Bobby and I see one of my closest friends living an absolute nightmare. There was no way that Dr. Doyle just said that. Everybody told us that the plan was for Nathan to go through. And I looked towards Heidi because she was the one that was telling us that the vote was Nathan. And even the whispers from the people that we knew were loyal to Blake were telling us that it was going to be Nathan. And Dr. Doyle was positive that it was going to be Nathan. So I turned towards Heidi absolutely furious because I feel like she lied to me. And the first thing that she says was, I was on the wrong side of the vote too. I don't know what happened. I thought everybody was on the same page. And I could feel all of the eyeballs on us from all of the other villagers. And they're looking at our core friend group and the astonishment on our faces. I couldn't believe what just happened. And then Blake broke the silence by saying, "Solve that puzzle, Bobby." And then it hit me. Bobby was the one that pulled the handle out of the combination puzzle. So they thought that he solved it. And nobody was whispering about volunteering. Nobody was considering the new information that was presented to us. They were whispering about the fact that Bobby was a target now, simply because he solved a puzzle that nobody else could, which made him a power threat. And in the moments that that was happening, the whispers must have made their way to Blake, and Blake changed the target of the day towards Bobby. She didn't like the fact that people were coming up to Bobby, Heidi, and I all day and treating us like we were a power trio. And she used this opportunity of Bobby solving this puzzle, or seemingly solving this puzzle, to get everybody to vote for him to break up our trio. I don't know what to say to Bobby at that moment other than I'll come with you. But Dr. Doyle responded to me in front of everybody. "No, you won't, Doug. We can't risk that again." He made it through once, he can make it through again. And maybe this time, he could actually make it home. My initial thought is I am not listening to him. I don't care. I'm gonna go with Bobby. He's the only person here I actually like. But then I realized that we had voluntarily given up our firearms, and Dr. Doyle and the other men of the village were not scared of us anymore. There was much more of them than there were of us, and the men that were loyal to Dr. Doyle made it very clear that they were not going to let us go in together. I could see how scared Bobby was, but he tried to make me feel better about the situation. He said, "Don't worry, I can make it back. I did it once, I could do it again." And now I shouted back towards him because they had dragged him all the way over to the gap and they were separating us. And he was about to be shoved through moments after they announced his name. We didn't even have a chance to have a conversation. The only thing I got to say to him was, "If you can get out, do it. I'll be fine." And just like that, Bobby is through the gap and he's gone. And everybody starts to disperse as if nothing happened. This is just every day. But my life is spiraling. Everything is falling apart around me. It's loosening at the seams and I have no idea what to do other than mourn my friend, who's now put into a life and death situation without me. I look at Heidi and I basically bark at her. We need to do something. So I take off running back towards the map room to find any bits of information that I can. So many things are running through my head at that moment. Maybe there's a way to open the gap so I can follow after him. There has to be some way that we could help him. So I rush into the map room and I start rummaging through things. I'm not in my right mind and I have no idea how to control my emotions at this point. And I could feel myself slipping into the internal torment that everybody else here is suffering from. It's only been a week and I could feel that this place is breaking me, and I know that I need to get out before it fully breaks me. Because only 2 more weeks from now, Heidi and Dr. Doyle could be voted out too, and I'm here alone. To be tortured and tormented and bullied and pushed around by Blake and her minions. It was do or die, and I needed to find answers immediately. And I wasn't going to let Heidi or Dr. Doyle attempt to calm me down. It was now or never. Heidi rushes into the map room after me, and I'm expecting her to attempt to console me. I was expecting a pep talk to look at the situation more logically, and I'm ready to bark at her again to tell her if she's not trying to help, get away from me. But when I look at her, I see the same fear in her eyes that I feel in my chest, and she says, "We're next if we don't do something." There has to be something else to that puzzle combination. I didn't even think about the puzzle combination or the possibility of going deeper into it. All I thought was, there's probably something in one of these journal entries that might give me a lead. But Heidi was right. We had something that nobody else had figured out up until this point. And the reason she hadn't been in the map room with me immediately, the reason she came in a couple moments later, is because she went and grabbed a piece of parchment paper to write down the code. And she was holding up that code in front of me. And under the code, she had the quote that was carved into the podium under the last 3 digits. And in quotations it said, "Find his name." And Heidi goes, "I have an idea, give me a second." And I see her counting on her fingers as she's reciting the alphabet under her breath. And she goes through the whole code, which is 511 513 383 201. She's writing corresponding letters to the numbers, and she says 511 is either EK or EAA. 513 is either EM or EAC, but 383 is CHC, and 201 is TA. So let's work through 2 options: EAA and EAC, CHCTA, and EKEM, CHCTA. Then she asks me, "Do you see any words in these letters?" The only 2 words I was able to make out in the first collection of letters was cachet and teach, and they didn't seem very important or relevant to our situation. But when I looked at the combination of the second letters, a phrase jumped off the page to me, and I basically yelled in Heidi's face, "Checkmate." And when I yelled checkmate, her eyes widened and she yelled back, "Roman." And I said, "What about Roman?" And she said the only thing that Roman does outside of talking to himself and yelling is play himself in chess. It must have something to do with him. We have to follow him. We have to find him, and we can't let him know that we're following him. It must have something to do with him. And I know that this entire thing that I'm explaining to you is such a stretch. And Heidi and I are jumping to crazy conclusions, following any lead that we possibly can. But that's where we were at. We had no other options. We had to passionately chase anything that even had the slightest hint of possibly getting us out of here. The amount of adrenaline that was running through my body made it feel like I was on the strongest Adderall known to man. I felt like nothing could get in my way from tracking down Roman and stalking him and finding out every piece of information that he knew. I didn't care if Blake started talking to us again. I didn't care if Dr. Doyle wanted to have a meeting in the tavern. I didn't care if the gap opened and a monster ran through it. My sole focus was to stalk Roman. And all of this is based on the fact that we did a word jumble that said checkmate. But you can't pretend like you wouldn't do the exact same thing in that situation. It's all we had. It was the only lead we had, and it was my only hope in getting out of this place. It was also the only thing that could keep my mind off of thinking about what Bobby was going through in that exact moment. One of my best friends is out there fighting for his life, and I can't help him. I had to think about anything else, and the only thing that I could get myself to focus on was our current mission. The reality was that I was breaking inside, and I was heartbroken that my friend was out there fighting for his life by himself, and I was blinding myself with a not-so-hot lead. But anyway, it only took us about 10 minutes to track down Roman. He isn't a hard guy to find. He's always shouting, and this place isn't very big. He was doing his regular routine. He was wandering the outskirts of the forest and then eventually wandered into town. He would wander into the tavern, grab scraps of food to feed himself, then go to a small table outside of one of the cabins and play himself in chess. Heidi and I were stalking him like we were mountain lions on the outskirts of a residential neighborhood that got a scent of a dachshund alone in a backyard by itself. We were locked in on this man's every move. I was looking at him like he held the keys to the universe, and we watched him for 2 hours, moving a chess piece, standing up, switching seats, moving a chess piece, talking to himself, switching seats, playing chess against himself. One eye looking down at the chessboard, the other eye floating around taking in his surroundings. Since the vote had just happened, everybody had a week of safety, so everybody's guard was down and nobody was filled with anxiety. They were doing their regular chores wandering around the village. It was rather lively around and everybody was acting much more normal than they were acting before. And obviously, everybody's completely ignoring Roman as they always do. But he saw us. He saw us watching him. Somehow he was able to decipher that we kept peeking at him. So I take another quick look at him, and his head is facing our direction. Neither of his eyes were facing us, but his nose was pointed towards us. It was like looking at a chameleon in the face. You couldn't tell if it was looking at you or it was looking at his right and left. So we looked away for a moment, then we peeked back at him. He was still looking at us. He knew that we were giving him attention. He knew that we were watching him, but he didn't sprint at us this time, and he didn't start yelling. All he did was gently move his chess pieces off the board and fold the chessboard in half. It wasn't one of those fancy boards that's all one piece. It was one of those cheap boards that you could fold in half to store it easier. And from the corner of our eyes, we could see that he's writing a message at the bottom of this chessboard. It only took him a couple seconds, and then he put the chessboard back down to flat and put the pieces back on top of it. He immediately left the small table, left his chess game behind, and went into the tavern. We knew at that moment that Roman left a note for us. He knew that we were following him. He knew that we wanted to communicate with him, and instead of risking our safety by running at us and shouting and having a verbal interaction, he wrote a note for us. It might have still been breaking the rules because we were technically communicating with him, but it was worth the risk at that time. We only waited about 20 seconds before nonchalantly walking over to the chessboard and folding it up to reveal the message. And we were reminded of a very cruel reality of the situation. Roman only spoke Russian, and this message was in Russian. We had no choice but to take this message to Dr. Doyle and get him to translate it. His entire life was committed to studying language. Even if he didn't speak Russian fluently, maybe he would be able to get an idea of what it says based on context clues. I don't know that much about language, but I can only assume that if you know a ton of languages, you might be able to piece together a sentence based on some keywords that you know from correlating languages. I don't think that's too much of a stretch of an imagination. So we do our best to slide the chess pieces to the side and conceal this board under my shirt. And we start searching for Dr. Doyle, and we find him in one of the cabins having a small meeting with a couple members of the brass. We didn't want him to translate this message in front of everybody, so we asked him to come with us to the map room because we had something very important to talk to him about. Everybody knew that I had just lost my best friend to the Gap, so nobody was suspicious that I wanted to talk to Dr. Doyle privately. I had a lot going on. They knew that I was probably going through it, so we were able to isolate Dr. Doyle and get him back to the map room, where we were then able to ask him about this message. I didn't know how I was going to explain where it came from. I didn't really care, but Heidi took the lead. All she said was, "I think we're onto something. Do you know what this says?" And I handed the chessboard from under my shirt, and she opened it up for Dr. Doyle for him to read the message. He squinted his eyes for a second, and he mumbled to himself, "Is that Russian?" And Heidi covered our tracks in that moment by saying, "We saw Roman write it, and we wanted to know what it said because we think he knows something." And I could tell that Dr. Doyle did not like the idea that this was a message from Roman, and he immediately said, Roman writes a lot of things, guys. He also says a lot of things out loud. Most of those things don't make sense. And Heidi shakes the chessboard that's right in front of Dr. Doyle and says, does what he wrote here make sense? And Dr. Doyle nods his head but then says, yeah, but I don't know what it means. I wasn't able to hold my frustration in anymore, and at that moment I could kind of see why everybody was getting so frustrated with him, because he would just walk up and read messages that were left all over this place and not say it out loud right away. So I just blurted out, maybe just say it. Maybe just say what it says. Can you tell me what it says? You want to say it? Clearly, Dr. Doyle had no idea the type of pressure that I felt on top of me. He had no idea just how upset I was with the vote earlier. And he had no idea how short of a fuse that I was on. I think that he felt like he built a level of rapport with me and built a level of respect that it would carry over into any conversation that we had. He had no idea what I was willing to do in this moment. He had no idea how desperate I felt, and he clearly had no idea how dangerous a desperate person could be. There are bad people in this world. There are evil people in this world. There's very greedy people in this world. There's people that lack empathy. There's people that lack sympathy. There's psychopaths. There's sociopaths. But I firmly believe that there is nobody more dangerous than a desperate man, because a desperate man doesn't have a choice. At least he feels like he has no options. So whatever opportunity is right in front of him for him to get ahead, he will do anything in his power to get out of his desperate situation. Dr. Doyle was clearly very used to gatekeeping his knowledge of language, so nobody figured out how to speak Gaelic. But there was no reason for him to not tell us exactly what this said immediately. It's in Russian, it doesn't matter. And he could tell that I was fuming, almost foaming at the mouth like a pit bull. So to avoid any further escalation of the situation, he said, I know its name. It says I know its name. So I whip my head towards Heidi now that I know what the message says, and I say, Roman is trying to tell us something. Remember what it said in the podium? It was carved in it. It said, find its name. And whatever that means, find his name, I know his name, Roman knows something. We have to talk to him. Now Dr. Doyle gets upset and he claps back at me like, what do you mean? Roman's trying to tell us something? Have you guys been communicating with him? I was not in the mood for a scolding, so I said, Roman saw us watching him, so he left us this note. If that means we're communicating with him, then yeah, we are. And I was expecting him to continue to scold us or shame us for what we were doing. But it was like all of the compassion left his eyes and he said one line before leaving. You might end up in pieces for that. Part of me couldn't tell if that was a threat or a warning, and I couldn't tell why the expression on his face changed, but something about it pissed me off. Something about the way he said it made me feel like he was leaving right away to go tattletale and tell everybody that we were communicating with Roman, and that we were liabilities no longer in the brass. But it didn't matter. I was willing to try anything at this point. I was going to turn over any stone that I could, and I was going to run through any wall that I had to, because nothing could be worse than being out there alone like Bobby is. And if I were to just sit here and wait for him to come back, I would be the worst friend in history. I had no idea what we were about to walk into. Part of me thought Dr. Doyle was going to call a village meeting and let everybody know that we were communicating with Roman, so nobody would start to talk to us, or they were going to try to band together to get us to stop communicating with Roman. So I start venting all of these thoughts to Heidi about my interpretation of what Dr. Doyle said to us, and my assumptions of what he's probably going to do about it. And I'm pacing back and forth trying to think about our next move when she cut off my train of thought. She said, I've seen that look on his face before. It wasn't the look of disapproval or anger. He's gonna let us do whatever we want. But that was the look of him emotionally disconnecting from us. He's not going to try to stop us or put any energy towards us, but he's mentally preparing to wake up tomorrow to our bodies scattered all over this village in pieces. When you have to make all of the decisions that he has to make here, you have to become cold to people when you see them going off the deep end. He could tell that you're not going to listen to him, so he has to focus on the people who will. Don't be frustrated with him. He's not going to get in your way. My emotions were through the roof still, so I didn't care about his feelings about the situation. The only thing that I cared about was our next move. So I asked Heidi, you think we should go talk to Roman right now? And she was much less emotional than me in that moment. Her decision was far more logical. She said, no, I don't think we should talk to him in front of everybody. But I do know where he sleeps. He has a little hut out in the forest. And maybe there's something in there that could get us closer to answers. And if we're gonna talk to him, we should probably do it out there to keep everybody else safe. I was okay with that answer because the plan was still to talk to him eventually, so I was down to go snoop around his house. It felt like a step forward to me, and it was a logical, emotionalist step forward. To barge into into the tavern and start barking questions at Roman in front of everybody was not the right move. Heidi was totally right here. But I wasn't trying to slow down our investigation. I was still off the Adderall. So I asked her right away, can you take me to his hut right now? I keep saying it, but every second to me that I wasn't doing something was another second that I was betraying Bobby's friendship. I remember what it was like out there. Heidi and I were both out there with him. Before we left the map room to go to Roman's hut, Heidi asked me to at least pretend to be calm. Everybody knows what happened, and they could probably assume that I'm pretty upset, but the worst thing that could happen in this situation is for them to start snooping around our business and following us around. And that's what people do here if they see that something's up with you. Everybody's looking for a reason to backstab you and vote you out next. I felt like we were actually onto something here, so we should protect it. And I was very happy to know that Heidi also felt that we were potentially onto something. I wasn't sure at first if she was just being empathetic towards me because I had just lost my friend. She was genuinely excited about this information as well, and she was willing to talk to Roman under the right circumstances with me. So I try my best to put a calm expression on and walk out of the map room and into the village, and we slowly, nonchalantly walk into the forest. And once we were in the forest, we picked up the pace because there was nobody out there. I didn't have to put on a show for anybody. It only took us about 10 minutes to get deep into the forest away from everybody else. And eventually, Heidi pointed directly in front of us, and I was able to see a small structure built alongside the trunk of a tree. It was a little hut, clearly made of scrap wood, taken off the cabins in the village. It was only big enough for one man to crawl into and maybe sleep in the fetal position. There was nothing spacious about this abode. It was no bigger than a doghouse, but it was worth investigating, and I was willing to wait around for Roman to get here so we could talk to him. But I was not willing to respect his personal privacy. I didn't hesitate for a second. I crawled into his little hut and I started rummaging through his things. There was damn near nothing in there. A couple pieces of clothing, a blanket, a homemade pillow. I wasn't seeing anything remotely important until I looked up at one of the walls. There was barely any light in there, so I couldn't see what it said until I put my nose up to it. There was carvings all over the small walls of this hut, and it was the same word written over and over and over again. I didn't know what it said, but it was the same word. I crawled out and I asked Heidi to crawl in because I knew she had a writing utensil with her. I told her to grab a piece of parchment from in there and write the word that she sees on the wall. She came crawling back out of that hut and she held the parchment paper up to me. The spelling looked right. I checked one more time just to make sure, and it was correct. But we had no idea what it said. We didn't know what this word meant. And to be honest, we didn't even know how to pronounce it. We didn't bother waiting for Roman at the hut. We felt like we found what we were looking for, so we hustled back to the village. And once we entered the village, we pretended to be calm again. We started walking slower, but we were looking for Dr. Doyle. He wasn't in the cabins or in the map room, so he must have been in the tavern. So we walk in there. It's very busy in the tavern. But Dr. Doyle's in the same spot that he was the first day that we spoke to him. And we walked right up to him and we sat next to him like our conversation is still going, and he seemed like he was not happy with us and he wasn't excited to continue our conversation. And the first thing that he said when we sat down was a very dismissive, "I'm eating." I felt so close to answers, and I didn't want to be disrespectful in that moment. Even though I wanted to slap him across the head, grab him by the hair, and press his nose into the note and demand that he reads this word to me, I took a different route. I said, "One more word and I won't bother you for another week." I felt like it was a simple bargain, very straightforward, and I made it very clear all he had to do was translate this one word and he wouldn't have to worry about us anymore. And he could enjoy his meal and we would leave. I very discreetly got the piece of parchment from Heidi and I showed it to him very quickly before putting it away. And I even managed to say, very politely, "It's okay if you don't know it. I'll leave you alone either way." He glanced up at it and I could tell that he liked the idea of me not bothering him, and he was planning on telling me what it said and then completely ignoring my existence for a week. But when his eyes looked at the word, I could tell that he didn't like what it said. And he looked at Heidi and I with fire in his eyes and he said, "Where did you find that word?" And I said, "Brother, can you please stop gatekeeping words and I'll tell you everything you want to know. I would love it if you'd help us." And I think in that moment, he had a realization how irritating it is to withhold what a word means from somebody. And I hope he realized how often he does it to people. And I think since I was being so straightforward with him instead of being passive aggressive like the other villagers, he had a realization why half the village turned on him, and it was because of moments like this. To pressure him further into just telling me what it said, I said we found it carved into Roman's hut. He wrote it about 600 times, so it must be important. Please tell me what it means. And Dr. Doyle put down his eating utensils and turned towards us, and in a very serious tone he said, "The way you pronounce that word is fiaknon. It means the hunter who keeps. And when I heard him say Fiaknon, I knew it was sinister. I could just feel it. I had never heard a word before that made my breath become shorter and my body fill with tension. And I was waiting for a further explanation about what Dr. Doyle must know about this word, because he said it as if he heard it before. I'm staring in Dr. Doyle's eyes and I could see a million realizations happening behind them. I could tell he's connecting dots in his head, but he can't find the words to express himself. He manages to say, yeah, I've read about it. They say it's a solitary fae. They say it's the one that plays with its food. His sentence and his train of thought is cut off with the sound of rain hitting the roof of the tavern. It was as if it was perfectly timed. And I look around the tavern at all of the village members enjoying their meals, and all of the relief that they had from my friend being voted out that day was stripped away from them by the sound of rain. And I didn't know why. And I'm looking around confused as everybody else is staring at the ceiling in silence. And I look at Heidi, and she looks back towards me and she says 4 words. It's never rained here. So much information is running through my head, and I don't know if the rain is a good sign or a bad sign. I don't know if it means that we're onto something or we're in trouble. And I could tell that nobody else here knows what to do, including Dr. Doyle. And I look to the corner of the tavern, and I see Roman in the corner staring at me. And everything in me wanted to talk to him in that moment. But right as I was about to act on that impulse, the bell rang. I had never seen the village members react so quickly to the bell. Usually everybody would be fairly quick about it. They would hustle to it because they knew what stakes were at play. But they were so on edge from hearing that rainfall that they jumped out of their seats, and that tavern was empty in seconds. They were hustling out that front door like they were evacuating a burning building. And before I knew it, we were all standing out in the clearing directly out front of the tavern, and everybody's whispering and chattering and looking up at the sky at the rainfall. I could tell that nobody thinks that the rain is a good sign, but I'm not sure what everybody's thinking about this upcoming game. I didn't care about this game. I wasn't about to play by the rules anymore. I felt like we were figuring things out and this was just a diversion, and I was planning on ignoring this game. We were onto something, and this place was trying to get us off track. But then I started hearing what everybody was whispering about. It was coming from every direction. I heard everybody saying, there's no game. The bell rang, but nobody found a game. Every member in the village was within 20 feet of each other, and there was a clear sense of fear and confusion. People were asking Dr. Doyle, like, what do we do? And then all of Blake's people were around her, chatting into her ear. But in my head, I'm putting everything together, all of the moments, all of the interactions leading up to this point. It was finally making sense to me. From speaking to Dr. Doyle in the tavern the first time, to all the oddly specific games, to Heidi explaining the relationship drama and the main vote, it was all pointing to one person, and now we knew its name. The rain was coming down heavily, and all of the villagers were looking around, wondering what to do next. And the bell rings again, and everybody knows that something is seriously wrong. The bell rings for a 3rd time, and I could see through the crowd of villagers that the gap opened the moment the bell rang the 3rd time. I knew that something was going to come through that gap and we were all in very serious trouble. But I also knew that we were onto something, and I felt like we were closer to an answer than we had ever been. I knew that the gap was open, and I knew that everybody's life was already at risk. If there was time to take a chance, it was right now. I didn't talk it over with anybody. I didn't get a second opinion. I rolled the dice. I risked it all, and I looked around the crowd, and he was already looking at me. And I shouted, with my finger up as a signal, Roman, point to Fiaknon. And his eyes lit up like I was the first person to understand him in months. And everybody looked at me like I was absolutely insane, and then shot their glances towards the ground. It was their instinct to ignore him. If they heard his name, they looked away. But Heidi and Dr. Doyle were with me, and they looked towards Roman because they wanted to see who he pointed towards. No one else knew who Fiaknon was. They just thought I was breaking a rule. And Roman lets out a big smile as if this is one of the best moments of his life, and lifts up his finger, and he points at the person with a very familiar, devilish smile. And I look at the direction in which he's pointing, and Blake is smiling back at me. And I'm staring at this girl, waiting for her to speak, and all of the other village members start to take their eyes off the ground and towards her as well. But there was something very off about her. She was always willing to speak up with a very snarky comment, but she's just looking at us with a smile, but like nothing behind her eyes. And I'm scanning her body up and down, and I notice that her feet start to change color, and her toes start to roll back in on themselves until her feet are like nubs, and then her calves start turning in on themselves, and then her thighs, and then I look up at her torso because there's nothing there below her waist. She seems to be disintegrating from the feet up, and once the disintegration starts encroaching past her belly button, I look back up at her face and her shoulders, and I see that somebody has their arm around her. And as I'm following that hand to the torso that it's attached to, I realize that Blake isn't disintegrating. She's dissolving and merging into the man that's standing next to her, giving her a side hug. And as she's disappearing, he's growing. His limbs and extremities are becoming abnormally large, and we realize that she was never anything but an extension of him. She was doing his bidding and causing chaos everywhere she went. And that same demon voice that we heard whispering to us in the darkness when we were deep in the gap, the Keeper said, "I'll give you all a 5-second head start." It was the Keeper this whole time. He was Fiachnon. He was the hunter who keeps. He acted as if he was an optimistic nurturer to everybody, so they would feel comfortable talking about anything around him, while he had an extension of himself doing his dirty work based off of what he would hear in the tavern. That's how the games were so specific. Blake didn't have people bringing secrets to her. She didn't have spies all over the village. People trusted Keep, so they would speak around him unfiltered, and he would immediately use what he heard against them to make the games that much more cruel. It was literally the first thing that Dr. Doyle said to me in the tavern. He said, "I would have given up a long time ago if it wasn't for this place, because out there, outside of the tavern, it's nothing but suffering. But no matter what happens and no matter who dies here, no matter what sick game this place throws at us next, I get to come to the tavern for a hot meal, a cold drink, and a warm fire. And for 1 hour, I feel like I might be okay. It gives me just enough hope to walk back out that door and be the pillar that all of these people need me to be." It all made sense now. Fiachnon is the hunter who keeps, and Dr. Doyle even mentioned that he plays with his food. It was clear that the Keeper used the tavern to give people just enough hope to stay. He didn't want his food to give up. He wanted to play with it, and he gave them just enough hope so they would keep going so he could torture them for another day. The Keeper's eyes had went black, and he had doubled in size. Whatever he really was, it was coming out. He looked like an ancient mutation that was built for killing. The Keeper started his countdown. 5, 4, and at the count of 4, Bobby came stumbling out of the gap covered in blood, and he collapsed to the ground and was crawling away from something that was clearly chasing him. And for some reason, even with Bobby emerging from the gap, everybody was standing still, frozen in fear, staring at the Keeper. And since nobody else had moved, I didn't know if I could move yet. I wanted to see what direction the other people were going to go before I made my move. But now that Bobby was out of the gap, my friend is right there, I figured that I was going to be the one that had to make the decision, because I need to go check to see if my friend is okay. He made it back, and the Keeper counted down to 3, and he let out a light, demonic chuckle as he said it. He laughed because he wasn't planning on counting down to 1. He grabbed the nearest villager by his chest and picked him up as if he was weightless. He gripped one of his massive disfigured hands around the man's torso and his other hand around his legs, and without hesitation, he tore the villager in half, and he threw his legs at half of the crowd and his torso at the other half, spraying the immediate area with blood. This caused immediate chaos, and somebody screamed, "We need to go through hell," causing just about everybody to sprint towards the gap. Half of the village clogged the gap, and everybody else that wasn't able to get through the gap immediately freaked out and started running into the forest into various parts of the village. And it seemed as if the Keeper was okay with letting people go into the gap, but he wasn't okay with the people running into the forest. He seemed to be herding people into the gap, and his first priority was to catch the people that had ran into the forest and send them back towards the village. But there was only one of him, so when he ran off into the forest to chase down the villagers fleeing, we got the chance to run up to Bobby. I didn't know what we were going to do because I knew that our only exit point was through hell. But Bobby looked absolutely exhausted and beaten to a pulp by whatever he just went through. The only people that hadn't dispersed the immediate area was me, Dr. Doyle, Heidi, and Roman. And we all ran up to Bobby and we dragged him behind the bushes that were right next to the tavern, but still fairly close to the gap. We knew we were going to have to make a run for it, but we needed to see how much energy he had. And once we got Bobby behind the bush, he started apologizing to me and I didn't know why. I was trying to talk over him because I wanted to convince him that he had enough strength to go through it again. And we could hear the Keeper terrorizing people in the distant forest. And we hear the sound of people getting torn to pieces and the sound of other people screaming at what they're witnessing and running back towards the village to go through the gap because they know that the forest isn't safe. And over all of the chaos and all of the panic, Bobby finally gets a real sentence out. He says, "I shouldn't be back here. I went through hell." I felt the shock hit our group. The confidence that we had that there was an exit completely faded. Even going through hell brought him back to the village. There was no exit. All of us were quiet, except for Roman, and he sounded hysterical, and we didn't even speak his language. So we were kind of ignoring him in that situation. But you can't ignore somebody when he slaps you in the back of the head to get your attention. And I was very happy that he did, because when I looked at him, it all clicked. Roman was holding up 2 pieces of parchment paper. One of them had a grocery list on it, and the other one, in big letters, said Fiachnon. And at that moment, everything made sense, and I think it made sense to everybody. The gap and the challenges beyond the gap were nothing but an endless loop of torture. Living in the village was an endless loop of chaos and drama. The games and the vote pitted everybody against each other, so nobody would be able to come to the conclusion of who the real enemy was. And when people were finally fed up with the horrible reality that they were living, their only source of hope came from the tavern, and the Keeper was standing there with a smile, blocking the exit with optimism. People would come to the exit when they were at their absolute lowest, when they were ready to give up, and he would give them a hot plate of food, a cold drink, and a pep talk, and they would turn around with a smidge of hope and walk right back into his endless loop of torture. It was genius, but we figured it out. But we had no time to tell anybody else. We knew who he was, and if he came back, he was not going to spare us. And there was nothing that we could do to keep that thing off of us. He was herding the people into the gap because he knew that even if they made it through, they were just coming right back to the village, and he could start the whole process over again. We couldn't wait around and help everybody. All we could do was get Bobby to his feet and frantically run inside the tavern and lock the door behind us. Not like the padlock would do anything to stop the Keeper from coming in here, but at least he couldn't see inside. We didn't wait a moment. We went behind the bar and into the kitchen, and it looked like a completely normal kitchen. It looked like he was really cooking for us. But in the back was the pantry that everybody knew about, but everybody seemed to give up on it. And I wanted to ask the group in that moment, when was the last time somebody checked this pantry? But internally, I knew that it had been months because I saw how everybody treated the tavern, how everybody treated the Keeper. They fully trusted him to run this himself. Nobody was checking on how he was doing his job. Nobody was going into the back to help cook and help clean. Nobody had been back here. It was only him. Heidi gets to the pantry door first and she rips it open so we could get Bobby through. And when the light illuminated the pantry, all of our hearts broke. Blake was gagged and chained to the wall, and she was dirty and emaciated. This was the real Blake. She didn't change and become evil. She was kidnapped, chained up, and mimicked by the Keeper. Roman grabbed a meat tenderizer off a nearby table and started taking whacks at the chains that were holding her to the wall. And he did it until they came out. We were able to get the gag out of her mouth, and she immediately jumped into Heidi's arms to embrace her. The first words that she asked Heidi were, "Where's Corey? Is he okay?" She had no idea what was going on. She had no clue about the chaos that was going on outside. She thought that we were just there to save her, and we had no time to explain it to her. And we also had no idea how we were going to escape. The only thing that we knew was that we were all going to shove ourselves in this pantry, close the door behind us, while holding a piece of parchment that said his name, Fiachnon. And we closed the pantry door behind us, and initially, Blake starts freaking out because obviously the only thing that she wants to do is get out of that pantry. She was screaming and crying, and Heidi was trying to console her. And I had Bobby leaning up against me because he could barely hold himself up. And a couple moments after that pantry door closed, it sounded and felt like a vacuum sucked all of the air out of that room. Everybody was talking all at once, and I heard everybody's voice, but I heard them all getting further and further away. I could still feel Bobby leaning on me, but when I reached out for the other people that were jammed into this pantry with me, I couldn't feel them. And then, eventually, I couldn't hear them whatsoever. And the same way that the air got vacuumed out of the room, it felt like it got poured back in. But it was less of the sound of air pouring back in and more of like somebody opening a window. And I reached my arms around me to feel the walls of the pantry, and they weren't there. I was in complete darkness, just like when we were in the gap, and the demon voice was whispering to us. And part of me felt like we were just teleported to that same section of the gap. But I saw some faint light in the distance, and I had to go. I had no other option. Even if I ended up back in the village, I wasn't just going to stand here in this darkness. Bobby was doing his best to help me, and we were able to keep a steady pace. And I knew that we were outside, and I knew that we were in a forest based on the sounds of my feet hitting the ground. And as we started to get closer to the light, I was able to see my surroundings a little bit more. I was able to see bushes and the bark of trees, but as we got closer to the light, the foliage got more and more dense, to the point where we were damn near fighting through it, having to smack branches and leaves out of our face. And we were just ducking our heads and forcing our way through to this gleaming light. And all of a sudden, all of the resistance of the foliage let up, and we fell forward onto our hands and our knees. And I look around, and we're at Mirror Lake, in the exact same spot that we found the hole in the trees. And I turn around, and it's just a tree line, and there's no hole there. We got out, but me and Bobby were alone, so we can only assume that everybody got sent back to where they came from. We managed to get out of the park, and we got home safely. We didn't see any other anomalies and any other tree lines on the way out. And we tried to make sense of the whole situation by searching up names of some of the people that we met. And there were a couple of local newspapers that published articles about miracles, a thought to be deceased person coming back to life after months missing. And from what we could tell, everybody made it home safe, at least everybody that left with us. For the people that went back through the gap, we have no idea what happened to them, and we could only imagine the worst. And a few months passed, and we received a letter from somebody. And it's not who you think. Heidi and Dr. Doyle didn't have anything to explain to us, and Blake didn't have anything to apologize for. We knew what we had been through together, and there was no need for more dialogue. But Roman had to explain himself. The letter was in very broken English. It was a very poor translation, but it went something like this. The day that I was exiled, the Keeper told me everything. He told me how to leave, and he encouraged me to, but I couldn't do it knowing the suffering that I'd leave behind. I needed to save someone. The solitude wasn't the real hard part. It was watching everybody suffer and ignore the solution. That was the real torture. A nasty creature that Faye was. I hope you guys realize that we're listening and we're trying to make the content that you enjoy. You'll come to find out over the course of this year that we're committed to making longer, scarier, and more detailed stories for you. We hope you're enjoying it so far. Make sure you like the video. Even consider subscribing, because I promise it only gets worse from here.